Hi all. Today we're going to talk about the central nervous system, and this will be broken up into a few different parts. So for the first part, let's sort of do a little bit of an overview. The central nervous system is going to include your brain and spinal cord, and this is your primary processing center of the nervous system. It is involved in interpreting sensory information, maintaining homeostasis, especially maintaining a lot of things subconsciously, such as blood calcium levels, things like that, and responding to those, as well as functions relating to the mind, consciousness, cognition, so on and so forth. So the functions of the nervous system can be broken down into three categories. You have motor functions. These are going to include stimulation of muscle cell contractions or that of a gland secretion, and the function of the peripheral nervous system, which are functions of the peripheral nervous system. Sensory functions, this is detection of sensations, whether internal environments or external environments. And this is also a function of the peripheral nervous system. When I say function of the peripheral nervous system for both motor and sensory functions, this is using those network of nerves to transmit the information back and forth. The third function is what we call integrative functions, and this is included in the decision-making process. This particular function of the central nervous system is exclusive to the central nervous system, and this includes a variety of functions, such as interpretation of sensory information, the ability to plan and monitor movements, maintenance of homeostasis, both consciously and subconsciously, as well as all higher mental functions such as language, learning, cognition, memory, everything under those aspects. So the primary structure of the central nervous system is the brain. The brain is composed of soft, whitish gray tissue, anatomically continuous with the spinal cord, and the brain will be housed within the cranial cavity. And as I mentioned, you're really going to have direct or indirect controls of most body functions. Direct would be, something that's more conscious and a direct action. Indirect could be more subconscious or actually acting through other intermediaries such as the endocrine system. Typical brain weighs between 1,250 and 1,450 grams and is made up mostly of nervous tissue. However, there is also epithelial and connective tissues as well. The internal cavities are called ventricles, and the ventricles are going to give buoyancy to the brain, but they also allow for circulation of cerebral spinal fluid. Cerebral spinal fluid is ultimately going to be the interstitial fluid that is going to nourish and essentially take care of the nervous tissue that makes up the central nervous system tissue. The brain will receive about 20% of total blood flow during periods of rest, reflects its requirement for huge amounts of oxygen, glucose, and nutrients. As it comes down to oxygenation, the brain must have a steady flow of oxygenation. The brain can only use glucose as a nutrient source as well. So those two things are very important. The brain will consist of 4 divisions, each distinct in the type of input it receives and where it sends its output. The 4 divisions are the cerebrum, or more commonly referred to as the cerebral cortex, the diencephalon, which is the hypothalamus, epithalamus, and the cerebellum, which is referred to as your little brain, and it's nestled underneath of the cerebral cortex. And then you have your brain stem, which is the pons, midbrain, and medulla. So the cerebrum, this is an enlarged superior portion of the brain. It is divided into left and right hemispheres. Each cerebral hemisphere is further divided into 5 distinct lobes, lobe names which you will see to be familiar in a minute. The cerebral cortex, or the cortex, is responsible for higher mental functions, such as learning, memory, personality, cognition, thinking, language, and consciousness. The cortex is also referred to as your conscious brain. Any conscious action that you are consciously aware of will occur by the cortex. It also performs major roles in sensation and movement as well. The diencephalon, this is deep underneath the cerebral hemispheres, sort of in what we would call the central core of the brain. It does consist of 4 distinct structural and functional parts, and the diencephalon is responsible for processing, integrating, and relaying information into different parts of the brain. So it's more of like a relay center as information's coming up from the spinal cord. It also has very important roles in homeostatic functions, regulation of movement, and biological rhythms or cyclical events that would occur in a somewhat good pattern. The cerebellum, this is posterior and inferior portion of the brain. It is divided into left and right hemispheres, and this is heavily involved in planning and coordination of movement, especially complex activities such as playing a sport or that of an instrument. Something that actually requires sort of a patterned or coordinated movement. Finally, the 4th distinct region of the brain is the brainstem. This is going to connect the brain to the spinal cord. So this is the connection point between those 2 structures. It is involved in basic involuntary homeostatic functions, things that you have absolutely no conscious control over. It will also control certain reflexes. It will monitor movements, and because this is where information coming from the spinal cord going to the brain, it will be very important in integrating and relaying information to other parts of the nervous system. And again, you'll actually see this figure as part of your assignment sheet. You know, the 4 main divisions here, and then their major functions. So this is actually a nice little summary sheet. Now your spinal cord, this is a long tubular organ enclosed within a protective vertebral cavity. This will blend with the inferior portion of the brainstem, and it ends between the 1st and 2nd lumbar vertebrae. It is typically anywhere from 17 to 18 inches in length, and only ranges from about 0.65 to 1.25 centimeters in diameter. So it's not a very large structure. The central canal is an internal cavity within the spinal cord, and this particular cavity is going to be continuous with the ventricles in the brain and allows for the flow of cerebral spinal fluid. Again, the main function of cerebral spinal fluid is that it helps to nourish the nervous tissue. It's sort of the interstitial fluid that has been formed by passing through the blood-brain barrier, so that anything that's in CSF is, for central nervous system tissue use. So there's 2 types of matter or nervous tissue. We have white matter. This is found in both the brain and spinal cord. And white matter is defined by the axons actually being myelinated. Each lobe of the cortex contains bundles of white matter called tracts. These tracts will receive input from and send output to clusters of cell bodies and dendrites in the cerebral gray matter called nuclei. The spinal cord contains white matter tracts that shuttle information processed by the nuclei in spinal gray matter. The gray matter is also found in both the brain and spinal cord and consists of neuron cell bodies, dendrites, and unmyelinated axons. The outer few millimeters of the cerebral cortex is gray matter. The deeper portions of the brain are mostly white matter, with some gray matter scattered throughout. The spinal cord is mostly gray matter that process information in the cord center, surrounded by tracts of white matter on the outside, and this will relay information to and from the brain. Communication between the gray and white matter connects different regions of the brain and spinal cord with one another. Myelinated axons enable near instantaneously communication between locations. Please make note, organization of gray and white matter in the brain and spinal cord is reversed. Spinal white matter is superficial while it is deep within the brain. So the first structure we're going to talk about is the cortex, which is what we refer to as the cerebrum. This is really the structure that is responsible for higher mental functions. The gross anatomy features of the cerebrum include sulci, which are shallow grooves on the surface of the cerebrum, gyri, which are elevated ridges found between the sulci, together increase the surface area of the brain, maximizing limited space within the confines of the skull. This is really a good example of structure and function core principles. Fissures, these are deep grooves found on the surface of the cortex. And the longitudinal fissure, this is a long, deep groove that's actually going to be responsible for separating the left and right cerebral hemispheres. A cavity is found deep within each cerebral hemisphere. The right hemisphere surrounds the right lateral ventricle. The left hemisphere surrounds the left lateral ventricle. And here we can see the cortex. Here's that longitudinal fissure. And you can see various sulci and gyri formed by the invaginations of the cortical tissue. There are 5 lobes that are part of the cerebrum. You have the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, temporal, occipital, and as I said, these names would sound familiar to you. And then you have the insula. Here you can see the frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital. The insula is actually going to be deep, okay? So the frontal lobes are your most anterior lobes. The posterior border is called the central sulcus, and it sits behind the precentral gyrus. Neurons in these lobes are responsible for planning and executing movements, as well as complex mental functions such as behavior, consciousness, and personality. The parietal lobes, these are just posterior to the frontal lobes, and neurons within these lobes are responsible for processing and integrating sensory information, as well as allowing you to function in attention. So also contributing a bit to consciousness there. The temporal lobes, these are going to form the lateral surfaces of each cerebral hemisphere. And neurons in these lobes are involved in hearing, language, memory, and emotions. The occipital lobes, this makes up the posterior aspect of each cerebral hemisphere. And this is where you're really going to process all information that's related to vision. The insulas, this is deep underneath the lateral fissures. Neurons in these lobes are currently thought to be involved in functions related to taste, as well as sensory information from the viscera, which is your internal organs. And here you can see the insula if you sort of remove the frontal and the parietal lobes here. So this cortex gray matter, functionally most complex part of the cortex. It covers the underlying cerebral hemispheres. Most of the cerebral cortex is neocortex, most recently evolved region of the brain. And it has an enormous surface area. It's composed of 6 layers of neurons and neuroglia of various widths, and all neurons in the cortex are actually interneurons. The functions in the neocortex revolve around conscious processing, such as planning, movement, interpreting incoming sensory information, and complex higher functions. And there are three primary areas of the neocortex, what we call the primary motor cortex, the primary sensory cortex, and association areas. So the primary motor cortex functions in planning and executing movement. The primary sensory cortex, this is the first region of the cortex to receive and process sensory information. And then finally, your association areas, this is where integration of different types of information will be processed. And we could sort of look here, and this sort of outlines various areas of the brain that are responsible for accomplishing certain functions. One thing, even though we do see certain areas being predominantly responsible for certain functions, any function of the cortex involves the entire cortex. So looking at the motor areas, most are located in the frontal lobe. These will contain upper motor neurons, which are interneurons that connect to other neurons, not skeletal muscle. The primary motor cortex is involved in conscious planning of movement and is located in the precentral gyrus of the frontal lobe. The upper motor neurons of each cortex cortical hemisphere control motor activity of the opposite side of the body via the peripheral nervous system, called the lower motor neurons, and execute the order to move. So generally speaking, the right side of the brain controls the left side of the body and vice versa. Movement requires input from many motor association areas, such as a large premotor cortex located anterior to the primary motor cortex. These motor association areas are unimodal areas involved in planning, guidance, coordination, and execution of movements. You also have the frontal eye field. This is paired motor association areas, one on each side of the brain, anterior to the premotor cortex. And this is really involved in the back and forth eye movements, which is a very important sensory function, and in this case would be very important, such as in reading. The sensory cortices, there are two main somatosensory areas in the cortex. The primary somatosensory area, which is often referred to as S1, and the somatosensory association cortex, which is often referred to as S2. Your sensory cortices are involved in special senses, such as touch, vision, hearing, smell, and taste. Each have a primary and a unimodal association area, as does sense of equilibrium, and this is found in all lobes of the cortex except the frontal lobe. The primary visual cortex at the posterior end of the occipital lobe. This is the first area to receive visual input, and is transferred to the visual association area, which processes color, object movement, and depth. The primary auditory cortex, this is in the superior temporal lobe. This is the first area to receive auditory information. The input is transferred to nearby auditory association cortex and other multimodal association areas for further processing. The gustatory cortex would be the area that's involved in taste. Your vestibular areas, this will deal with equilibrium and positional sensations, meaning where are you in space? Your brain knows, are you sitting upright, are you laying down? It always has a sensation of where your body is in space. Olfactory cortex, this is responsible for the sense of smell. And again, this is just that image we saw a few minutes ago that sort of shows all of these particular areas. Some multimodal association areas. Language, this is processed in two areas of the cortex. You have Broca's area. This is located in the anterior lateral frontal lobe. This is a premotor area responsible for the ability to produce speech sounds. So this particular area is responsible for allowing you to actually move the muscles that allow you to produce sound. Wernicke's area, on the other hand, this is in the temporal and parietal lobes, and this is for your ability to understand language. This is the area where you'll be able to cognitively develop words. And this is where, a lot of times stroke patients, first of all, Broca's area is typically an area where we see damage during most cerebral vascular accidents. And what can happen is they lose the ability to speak or the ability to properly get words out. That doesn't mean they cognitively don't know what they want to say. They do. And oftentimes what might come out of their mouth is gibberish. And it can be a very frustrating experience for the person that is undergoing the stroke. The prefrontal cortex, this will occupy most of the frontal lobe. It communicates with the diencephalon, other regions of the gray matter, and the association areas located in other lobes. Many functions of the prefrontal cortex include modulating behavior, your personality, learning, memory, and contributes to the overall personality state of the individual. Your parietal and temporal association areas, these occupy most of their respective lobes, and these will perform multiple functions including integration of sensory information, language, maintaining attention, recognition, and the ability of spatial awareness. And, this sort of goes over a lot of those areas we just talked about. There's a lot. This is probably a good slide to have that covers the past 20 slides, where it goes over the area name, the location of where you would find it, and more importantly, the particular function. And don't get me wrong, there's going to be some overlap between these areas as far as their functions are concerned. The white matter of the cortex can be classified as one of three types. You'll have commissural fibers. These are going to connect the right and left hemispheres. And this particular structure is called the corpus callosum. This is the largest of the four groups in this category, and it lies in the middle of the brain at the base of the longitudinal fissure. Projection fibers, these will connect the cerebral cortex of one hemisphere with other areas of the same hemisphere, other parts of the brain, and spinal cord. These fibers that are spread out in a radiating pattern are referred to as the corona radiata. You also have condensed areas around the diencephalon to form two V-shaped bands called internal capsules. The third type of white matter is association fibers. These are restricted to a single hemisphere. They connect gray matter of the cortical gyri with one another. So essentially what you have is you have your association fibers, which are going to be communication within the same part of the brain. So say right hemisphere with right hemisphere. Projection fibers, these are fibers that go, say, from the cortex down to another part of the brain. And finally, your commissural fibers, this is going to connect right versus left hemispheres. The cerebrum limbic system, possible pathways for information transferred by conduction of action potentials from one region of the brain to another. Action potentials will originate in the gray matter. Action potential is sent to another area of gray matter by projection fibers. A second or new action potential is generated by the gray matter and spreads to neighboring gray matter by association fibers. And lastly, a third action potential is generated and can be sent to the other cerebral hemisphere by commissural fibers. So that's all communication within the brain itself. The limbic system, this is an important function of the brain system. It includes the limbic lobe, the hippocampus, the amygdala, and pathways that connect each of these regions of the gray matter with the rest of the brain. This is really found only within mammalian brains and it is involved in memory, learning, emotion, and behavior. And the limbic system is really what sort of sets us up above many of the other species. The limbic system is also referred to as your emotional part of the brain, which takes information from multiple areas. Okay, so that's it for the cortex, or the cerebrum. The next structure we're going to talk about is the diencephalon, and I will pick up with the diencephalon and the brainstem in recording number 2.